We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
Welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly. Hey, if you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly related, go to securityweekly.com/subscribe, where you can find and subscribe to your favorite podcast catcher. You can sign up on our YouTube channel, our mailing list. You can join our Discord server, which is always a great conversation, and I appreciate that from our loyal listeners for Security and Compliance Weekly. And of course, we're also on that thing called Twitch, which I still refuse to look at, but I know you young millennials like to look at it. Also, of course, if you've missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, you can find them in our online portfolio, which is found at securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right. So I want to jump back into the discussion. I know Scott had some questions. I think Josh has a question in there. I want to level set and frame very quickly because I think PCI, for better or for worse, has influenced a lot of this pen testing industry. And I think most people would acknowledge that. That saying, PCI doesn't help. When the PCI data security standard first came out, it just said do a pen test, and it really didn't define it at all. I, as a QSA, as an assessor, or sometimes mistakenly called an auditor, I could accept just about anything. I could accept a client running Nmap with particular parameters to satisfy the pen test because there really wasn't some definition. Later on, they came out and said, you know, one of the first requirements is you have to have a defined penetration testing methodology where you detail, what the pen test is about, which was great. But most of my clients, most companies that I see, sort of defer to the methodology that's written up in a statement of work when they've gone out and hired a pen test company. So that's one layer of the problem. The other layer of the problem is just in terms of this lack of understanding and distinction, which was Scott, I think it was trying to bring out in the first segment. What's the difference between a pen test and a vulnerability assessment and a red team? PCI, for example, requires certain things, and which I think a crowdsourcing company might help with and might satisfy depending on where things are, but lack of understanding is a problem. First and foremost, starting from the top, requirement 6.2 is the requirement that requires patching, and the language for that is install critical security patches within 30 days of release of the patch. Then you go on to 6.6, where it talks about doing some sort of protection of web-facing applications, either by doing a security assessment, a web application pen test, if you will, or having a web application firewall. So even that, it's optional. And in terms of what constitutes a passing security assessment of the web app, they point back to 6.5, which is essentially the OWASP top 10, and they say at least remediate all of those things. But the language there is correct all the discovered vulnerabilities in that exercise. Then we jump forward to requirement 11, where you get into first the vulnerability scanning, which is 11.2, internal and external. Internal vulnerability scanning, you're supposed to address all high-risk vulnerabilities. The external, which is the ASV scan, which is what most people are familiar with, that's sort of regimented separately and it has its own criteria, but simplistically, it's all CVSS 4.0 and above scores, or medium and higher. Then you get to the penetration testing requirement, 11.3, again, internal and external. And there it says, make sure that you've addressed all the exploitable vulnerabilities that come up during the pen tests. Additionally, which we should touch on at some point, the penetration testing, whether internal or external, needs to be performed by qualified individuals. So somewhere down the line, I want to ask you, Casey, what constitutes qualified in terms of who you let participate, your contractors or employees or whatever. And then finally, finally, exploitable vulnerabilities for the pen test. You've got, depending on how you look at it, it's critical. Depending on how you look at it, it's high-risk vulnerabilities. Depending on how you look at it, it's medium vulnerabilities, or OWASP top 10, make sure all vulnerabilities are addressed. And then finally, exploitable. Yeah, clear as mud. Go. How do you do all this, Casey?
Yeah.
And there's
you
your
do it
answer.
all.
Thank you, sir.
Good times.
Yep.
You just do it. It's fine. It's easy, right? I think, with the risk prioritization piece, one of the things that we noticed pretty quickly after we kicked Bugcrowd off was this, two things that needed to happen. One was there to be kind of this Rosetta Stone to help people kind of baseline around risk and speak a common language between the folks that are working on the supply side, finding issues, and our customers.
Oh, and if I can interrupt real quickly, Casey, just because I forgot to mention it, and you're saying it, and it's very important. By the way, PCI requires you as an organization to define all these terms in terms of your organization. So you as an organization get to define what critical, high risk, medium, low, exploitable means in the context of your organization. But again, most clients I have, they just simply refer to whatever the result is from whatever scanning technology they employ, or whatever the pen test report says, which is an extension of whatever the scanning technology has said is the criticality. I apologize for not including that. Please proceed.
No, it's all good. So what we did is we created a vulnerability, what we call a vulnerability rating taxonomy, which is essentially a list. It's pretty much all of the different lists of vulnerability classes that exist out there, including OWASP top 10 and others. It's collapsed back into like a baseline technical severity, and that at least provides a starting point. To that you can multiply based on temporal risk or impact that's happening on your end. Really the purpose of doing that was to give everyone like a clear starting point based on the finding of the particular kill chain that they're submitting on the crowd and the hunter side. But then also, I think this is the second reason for doing it, helping organizations that we work with answer that question that you were just kind of calling out. Like how do we create a taxonomy? How do we document that? How do we actually assess and implement consistent approaches to risk management when it comes to vulnerabilities within our organization? And the big thing with the VRT is that we open sourced it. So if there's anything in there, and this has come up with different classes over time, where people want to kind of argue the toss on it being more or less severe, that all is a conversation that can happen in public, which I think is the right thing. Like being able to have that conversation be crowdsourced and open and transparent in terms of how different people approach it, and so on. That's our attempt to make that risk prioritization question a little bit easier, and that runs through all of the different kind of requirements that you just called out. With patching, it's been interesting consistently. Again, like there's bug du jour or something hectic creates a trash fire on the internet, and everyone goes out and patches and loses their weekend. What we tend to find is that there's a whole bunch of stuff that people miss. So this is kind of the convergence of the patching requirement and stuff like attack surface management, and the idea that organizations have a larger than probably accepted attack surface that they're not aware of. That's something that hunters are very good at finding in any context, really, like be it a pen test that we're running, or a public bug bounty or a VDP. We've seen that with a whole bunch of stuff over the past 18 months in particular, just given all the runs that have been done on remote access software and the trend towards remote access and people making their systems more accessible to the public internet in general. So I'll pause there because there's like anywhere you want to kind of tap into this and kind of lead the conversation. You kind of gave me a laundry list of stuff to answer there.
Sorry about that. Scott, did
as
you have
as compliance
questions?
standards can tend to do, right?
Yes,
I will.
They're left for interpretation.
I will shortly. I'm formulating the next question now.
Okay,
So let me-
Josh,
let me-
you tried to
So
jump
let me-
in a while ago, so take a turn,
No.
Josh.
I mean, this has been a great conversation. It really has. I mean, and in Discord, we're talking about how F the press was like, definitions are the framework of IT. Why is this? I got the impression that was being asked was, why is this so controversial? And you'd think so, but realistically, defining what IT and InfoSec and cybersecurity and whatever do is a massive endeavor. Scott asked that question before. What's the difference between vulnerabilities, vulnerability assessment, and pen test, and red team, and a purple team, and somebody's probably got a fuchsia team, and whatever the hell else. Okay, so then you've got the question of and Scott, you mentioned p-test. Thank you. That was a great point. They tried to define it, Nickerson and a few others, and it's still controversial. And it's difficult. So then, you've got Bug Crowd, which is in the essence of crowdsourcing. You're trying to develop a level playing field so that anybody who has an iota of skill or talent can play at some level. You can look for the small bugs, or you can get better and look for the big bugs.
Yeah, that's right.
But you have to define. A part of the problem is you have to define, what is a little bug? What is a big bug? What are the levels that we price at? What are we, what's out of bounds? Hell, defining the scope is a God-blessed nightmare. And, it's the definitions of the pieces of this. So I'm taking it back to where you work and live and built, Casey,
Sure.
is that just defining the scope, defining what is a small bug, a $5 bug versus a $50 versus a $500 versus a $5,000 versus a $5 million. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go along. Dollar bug is got to be a bloody nightmare. And so then when you talk about that kind of thing, this is where definitions, when you try to, if I'm just chatting, I go, I did a vulnerability assessment. Oh, did you test it? No. So it's a vulnerability assessment. You didn't test the exploitability. It just looks sort of exploitable.
You can come back to it.
But when I go, no, I exploited it. That's not a vulnerability assessment anymore. You're really doing some form of a pen test. Okay. We can discuss, and in our casual conversation, we can make our own set of definitions that are appropriate and reasonable for that conversation. But when you have to put them into legal documentation, into contracts, somebody goes, well, I found a bug. I want $5 million. You're like, dude, you found a bug that puts an extra A on the end of every username. Big deal.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like, and I think this goes back to Kat's question earlier on around people kind of peering in at the community that's forming around this and getting confused by all the noise. Like there's oftentimes, again, in the context of a public bug bounty program, debates and people opining around, that thing should have been paid more or less or whatever else. In reality, it's a marketplace, I think, for data that can lead to risk reduction. On one end of it, like that cost or that price is defined by the transaction itself. But on the other end of it, part of what we've learned and what I know very clearly is that, the better you can align expectations before you get things moving, the more smooth that conversation is going to be. So like there's a balancing act there as well.
There's a balancing act, and there's also a certain amount of it's almost education and awareness of the consumer. Penetration testing, which is what PCI says you're required to do, however you define it. And me as a QSA comes in numerous times with my customers. I try to explain to them, look, this is an opportunity for you in essence to figure out how well you're doing with all the other things. I mean, I see it as, the PCI requirements are somewhat linear, even though they claim they're not. And, the penetration test is one of the last things you do to test how well you're doing everything else. And, whether it includes exploitation or attempted exploitation, again, I knock PCI, the Security Council, for giving just enough wiggle room in the language to make us have to have hours-long conversations about what does it all mean, rather than just putting a stake in the sand. But they are very adverse to putting a stake in the sand.
Yeah, CFEA. Like there's all sorts of different other standards that go back in time trying to define what's okay and what's not okay, what's expected and shouldn't be in our space. CFAA is one that jumps immediately to mind. It's like worded quite simply, but there's a ton of devil in the detail. Like once you get to the fringes of it, it just kind of blows up.
We've got to ask, because we just had an episode about that, but did the recent case about CFAA with that police officer change how you do business?
Yeah. It didn't change. It didn't change what we were doing materially. Like honestly, it was something that we, Bugcrowd's always been a supporter of basically, as clearly as possible delineating the work of good faith hackers as opposed to the malicious, attackers that most of these laws were written for. So we were stoked. The Disclose.io project, which I co-founded with a bunch of other people back in 2016, like we wrote letters into the amicus brief. Bugcrowd was a part of that as well. So I think everyone was celebrating because, again, like we're back to this idea of it being more clearly defined, and because it's more clearly defined, it's enabling smoother and more kind of repeatable process going forward. So. Yeah, it didn't change, what we're doing to your question directly, but there was a lot of other good stuff. There was definitely some, champagne popped in the office that night.
Actually, we're in Twitch. We're seeing. I apologize, Scott. Let me just add one quick thing. In Twitch, there's a J Beers 11 is talking about how if red teaming or bug hunting, this is what vulnerability is as a definition, but blue team and developers might have a fully different definition. And I thought that was a really good point. I just want to throw that in there, Scott. It's yours.
Yeah.
No. I got you. Okay. So, Casey, we've had a really good chance to talk about the esoteric goodness of bug bounty programs, about penetration testing, about the good nature of doing this for either a compliance regulation or for other means of protection, right? On Twitter, I have somebody that has reached out to me and has asked the following question. This is coming from Jonathan Scott at Jonathan Data One, and he's asking point blank, talking about the other side of the spectrum, why the bug bounty programs are continually making critical vulnerabilities as informational. Why are they marking them as informational and then immediately patching the vulnerability, then not allowing the researcher to disclose the vulnerability, or they will be exited or deplatformed from the program, even though it's a non-issue. And a lot of this is stemming from what's happened recently, not just on Bugcrowd, but also on HackerOne. And how can you address that? Like the critical identification by people who are doing the work and then them not getting the recognition for the work itself, instead getting smacked on the wrist and deplatformed.
Yeah, no, for sure. So when we see, going back to the community management comment that I was making earlier, alignment of expectation, then making sure that those expectations are followed up on. That's a large part of what the team does within Bugcrowd. Like we've got all the software and all the data that powers the software to create matches between the right people and the right targets and so on. But then there's this group of people that effectively work to make sure that things stay kosher and fair, and everyone understands each other as things proceed. So when there's a misunderstanding, or when there's something that we see on the vendor side, on the customer side, that isn't in line with what they've committed to do, we'll actually step into the middle of that and try to resolve it. If we can't with them, then we'll oftentimes bridge the gap ourselves. So that's a very active part. I think this idea of that being rendered as something that constantly happens. The person who asked that question actually has no way of validating that. They can only speak from their own experience. Like the perspective I can speak from is watching people and staying up with bug crowders over weekends, trying to burn this stuff down and make it fair for everyone who's involved. So there's that. I think, in terms of disclosure and recognition and all those different things, like there is a distinct difference. And I think this is actually, pretty confused at this point, again, in the market between, a public program where, the origin of discovery of the issue is just from people being on the internet and having access to software that they can look at, right? Like that's one thing. On the other hand, you've got, a specific invite being extended to people to do a specific set of things that has conditions around it in a similar way that you'd expect if you were being brought on as a contractor to do work. And, the expectation is if you're being extended that invite and you're accepting those terms, because you do have the option to not accept them, then you're going to follow through, based on that. Oftentimes, if there's additional privilege, for example, like we've done work where, we're bouncing around, I mentioned the source code example before, getting dropped off behind the firewall to do internal testing, all those sorts of things. We want to make sure that we've got people in the mix on that type of program that, if we say, hey, you can't share, like you have to conduct yourself as though you're a pen tester working for a consulting company. Can you do that? We put a lot of work in to understand whether or not the answer to that's yes for people that will bring into those sorts of programs and other sort of things. So I think a lot of where those questions come up from that you were just asking, Scott, is people that actually confuse those two modes. And I think it does go back as well to this idea of, folk kind of glossing over the 25 or 30 years of history of people, trying to get vulnerability disclosure right. And not so far succeeding, but making little steps of progress, but then kind of just skipping to the end game where they feel like I should be able to talk about whatever I want.
So as an
brought it up,
hold on, Jeff. I really need to ask this. As an influencer to Bug Crowd directly, is there any way that I can challenge you here live on air to go to your people and say, listen, we are a community, we are crowdsourcing, aka community. Can we reach out to people that have been deplatformed in the past for bug bounty releases and disclosures and reach out to them and say, you're welcome back into the fold? It seems kind of against the grain, if you will, for lack of better words.
Honestly, I understand the question. I think the way that you're framing that is pretty kind of broad brush and a little bit overly simplistic. Like we work real hard on that stuff, but I think off the back of this conversation, I'll go back to the team and have that conversation. Not about saying cool, like we're going to let everyone back in, but to say, hey, like let's have a fresh look at this and see if there's anything that we can resolve and make better.
Or maybe a method for when people do get deplatformed, either justly or unjustly, for them to be able to reach out and try to get back in, like have like an adjudication method,
a rehabilitation program. That's what you mean.
You could say that, but I think it's a little bit more. I think it's a little bit more, yes, than just rehabilitation. And I think rehabilitation is not the right word for this.
Yeah, and I'll kind of end that to say that like there is recourse for that, like the support team, the opportunity for mediation, again in public programs. So the private ones that we're doing, we've basically gone to lengths to make sure that the folk that we invite into those programs are the ones that understand that like that's sort of out of scope for this one. We're bringing you in, like there's going to be a set of rules that you have to follow that are going to be different to what we believe is how the regular internet works in that sort of sense. But the idea of mediation in those public programs and the teams that receive those requests and go into bat and try to smooth everything over, we're pretty busy with that, and we actually have really good success. There's definitely a failure bias on the stories that end up getting out, that people end up talking about, because folk are, I think, more predisposed to talking about the stuff that goes wrong than the things that work out well.
While we're on the topic, Casey, could you just briefly, not in terms of rehabilitation or remediation or any of the whatever we call this program to bring people back in the fold. Can you just touch briefly on sort of the concept that I introduced at the top of the segment, that PCI for specifically, or for example, requires qualified testers?
Yeah.
What do you guys do at a high level to vet the crowd?
Yeah, for sure. It's really two dimensions. It's skills and trust. So what do people know? What have they demonstrated the ability to do? And what kind of technology contexts do they have? So is this someone who's experienced in payment gateway, architecture, for example, or particular languages, so on. We've got a basically system that we refer to as CrowdGraph. That's effectively, a skills map of the different people that we've got on the program, and the idea is to get the right people, connected to the environment that they're going to be testing. On the other side of that, there's trust. Trust in part goes to, how long have we known this person for? Like, what have we seen go on the platform? It ranges all the way from we don't know them from like Adam or Eve, because it's a VDP and it actually doesn't matter. It's just information coming in from the outside world, right up to okay, we've progressed them through private invitations. We've extended the offer to go through a background check. There's things that we do in addition to that, and really what you end up with is the spectrum of levels of trust that we basically match to the needs of the customer. So if there's a really high end requirement, then we'll use more of those things and kind of get to the top of that spectrum. If it's lower, the advantage of being able to loosen the things that you need from a trust standpoint is that you actually get access to a broader variety of skills. So it becomes, again, another one of these kind of balancing acts and these trade-offs that we help our clients through to basically get the best results we can.
Interesting. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't, add a footnote or an asterisk that PCI does not actually give any type of definition of what they're looking for in terms of qualified. So it is in large part up to the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, my understanding of that oftentimes is that it has more to do with skill than trust or like employment history, and we very definitely focus on that for everyone that we've got on the platform. So if you're getting an invite to a program that has this kind of requirement set around it, we're gonna make sure that they can do the right things.
Yeah, I think you're being generous, within PCI, since I have to assess against this. If you're an external third party doing a pen test, the presumption is, and I'm reading between the lines because there's nothing written there. If you're a pen testing company and that's kind of what your business is, the presumption is you're qualified. Much more scrutiny and detail is provided because PCI does allow for internal resources to do the penetration testing, and even then they're looking more for logical separation between the developers, the administrators, and the ones doing the testing. They want there to be some sort of line of demarcation, so there isn't an internal conflict of interest. But that's about it. There isn't much written down in terms of motives, test, qualifications, certifications. We add that as QSAs, trying to come up with some sort of baseline that we can give to multiple clients and be consistent. But it's not coming from the council ultimately.
I think that's one of the interesting things about this space, because to the intent and to the letter of a lot of these standards, we're able to sail through the requirements like as written, and I would argue do a better job. The main point of friction that we tend to have in the compliance space is the assumption that, oh, you're a bug bounty company, or you're a this is an approach to solving this particular problem that I'm not familiar with. So as an auditor, I'm going to potentially say no, which on the customer end, that puts the business driver for doing all of this in the first place at risk, and they're more likely to skip it over or not see it as an option. So it's good to have the opportunity to have this conversation around it, because we've seen it succeed. We've built products like for the express intent of actually making it succeed. So this is a thing that we do well. Working with like MasterCard and a bunch of other organizations that actually do it for the express purpose of satisfying these types of requirements. That to me is not really up for question in terms of if there's problem solution fit. It's more around like, do people actually get that? And is there so much confusion and noise, I think, to some of the stuff that we've talked about earlier on, that it kind of drowns that piece of it out.
Right. Hey, Josh, can I get you to read the Beers newbie comment from Discord? It looks like this is the guy coming over from Twitch, it looks like. Please.
Yeah. So the deal is, and he wrote something interesting. He said, look, and his, I assume it's a him, sorry, Beers, their point about you really have to show the impact for the HackerOne or BugCrowd or whomever, or even a direct client, to determine, wow, I care about this. And that's a really good point, I think, because if you don't show impact, they don't care. It doesn't reel to them. But Beer's point in this case is that it also works for the crowdsourced bug bounty platform like HackerOne or BugCrowd, in that. If they say that they've got a lot of times had their findings marked as informational and duplicate, and you have to show impact. That impact has to apply to those definitions of vulnerable for that client. And since you have to push your bug as far as you can, hoping that it qualifies, doesn't that count as gambling rather than freelance pen testing?
Yeah, this actually goes back a little bit to something that you were saying before, Josh, around the like going after like the hardcore issues or the things that are higher impact versus doing vulnerability assessment. Like my observation is that you've got kind of spectrums of appetite of testing across the community, and it's interesting because it gets reduced back to like this is a good hunter that can create good impact, or this is like someone who's kind of newbie or whatever that's going after kind of lower hanging fruit. I don't think it's that simple. I think some folk are just better at creating workflows and looking for issues that are comparatively easier to confirm, but then probably going off and looking for them in places where other people haven't. Like that's something that we see a lot, right? And then you get others that they're just thinking about, like the way I think about it is people that kind of symptomatically hunt. Then there's people that tend to come from a development background that understand what the symptoms infer about the underlying architecture. So they start to think second and third order in terms of chains that they can create. And then you get the folk at the kind of the top of the group who are just thinking about the gold. And for them, like technology and process and the different things that might be involved in getting from A to B are kind of transparent to them almost. But really, it takes all kinds, right? Because if you're just going after the top stuff, like the stuff at the top of the group that I just kind of laid out, then you're going to miss all the other things that create a reputational issue or could get chained together into something bigger in the future. Like all of those different things. It's not just one bucket of issues that need to be addressed.
It's interesting. I actually just asked, so they put in all this work and not knowing if it's going to pay off, even though it is a vulnerability, it still might not pay off. So you put in the work to find them, that's gambling. Then you put in the work to report them and not know if they're going to pay off, that's gambling. That's what they're saying. I'm like, all right, so is Bitcoin mining gambling? Because you put in all this work, you might not get a reward of the Bitcoin mining. Okay. And I said, is Bitcoin mining gambling? They said, yes. And it's fascinating. The mindset, if you will, that this is a gambling endeavor, not just a work thing, if that makes sense. I'm just stuck on that a little bit.
No, for sure. I get that. I think to call it out and to speak to what I was saying just before, like we do run programs where it's basically, the engagement model is like pay for effort or pay for completion of task as opposed to reward for success. One of the reasons for that, as we just talked about, is to be able to speak to methodology in a way that's easier to understand on the customer side. The other reason for that on the hunter side is to basically give opportunity for people that have this particular issue, right? So if you're not comfortable with basically competing to find issues in like the classic kind of pay for success bug bounty model, like your option is to just not do it. Like you don't have to do it. There's no twisting.
No. Agreed.
But what we wanted to do was to create an outlet for that and actually give people the opportunity to pursue more things in different ways from an engagement standpoint.
So to clarify, hopefully for others' edification, but me in particular, I'm curious. Is it typical for your company or for a bug, a bug bounty type of company to pay out to their researcher that's found something strictly based on what the ultimate customer thinks about the vulnerability, or do you guys sort of introduce your own sort of threshold or criteria or milestones that?
Yeah, so that's where the VRT comes in to try to standardize that as much as possible. So we use that to level set with the customer when we bring them on. The other thing that's a pretty like hard and fast requirement is that if there's classes of issue or particular types of vulnerability that the recipient's not interested in receiving, like you should say so. So you'll see that. You'll see exclusions in the brief, all those different things. Mm-hmm. They're still going to take that information on, but it's laid out very clearly that like this is not the stuff that we're wanting to attract, nor that we're wanting to actually pay for. From my perspective, this is where I think you can get into an argument of the toss quite a bit on this one, but that's at the discretion of the people that are paying for what gets submitted to them. Like the thing that we try to create accountability around is saying so in advance so that the expectations are aligned and people can kind of opt out.
Yeah, I think that maybe the disconnect, just from this conversation, maybe the disconnect is that security researchers, what I've seen is they really depend on that third party to bring themselves and the company together, and that there's some sort of like during triage and things like that the triage folk might say, no, really, this really is an issue. And I think maybe that's where the community's disconnect is. I think that's their expectation, is for like a bug crowd to like have their back on something that's legit. But then the and kind of almost to be that medium to educate that company on why that would be a legit finding.
Yeah.
But those companies are the ones that, per these different requirements, they are able to define what's important to them. But that's for 30 years. That's what's been wrong, right, with submitting stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, 100%. You're right. Like, it's an interesting challenge to solve. One of the things that we don't do ever is delete issues in that sense. Like the triage process, when you think about it, there's especially in the context of again a public program where you're effectively listening to the entire internet, right? Like there's a lot of noise. So our job is to jump into
the other side of that, where you're trying to take a look at that stuff. And I've been in the not triage for like bug crowd, but like I've a long time ago been in the NOC where you are triaging a lot of noise into legit stuff. And so I totally get it. There's humans, totally get that. Go on, sorry.
And there's a massive spectrum of the nature of that noise too. Like there's folk that trying to exploit the process. There's people that get a 11 out of 10 for enthusiasm, but maybe a 3 or a 4 for effectiveness, like in terms of like where they're up to in hacking and getting this kind of information across. Like part of what we do with those folk is try to educate them and help them get better. And that's so they can work with us, and it's so they can develop their own career as well. So there's a lot of different aspects to that. But going back to what you're bringing up around triage, like we're not actually gatekeeping that. Like what we're doing is trying to like surface and identify the things that are most important for the recipient to act on first, based on our assessment, and based on looking at what all's going on across their entire program, not just an individual report, and then all of the other programs that are happening at the same time, which is where a lot of what we've done with the platform and the data science side of things has actually helped out with that. So there's a lot more going on where I think, to your point, this idea of a conversation, it's like being the sound guy at a rock concert, right? Like you only notice they're there when they screw up or when something goes wrong. I think being in the middle from a triage standpoint in particular is kind of similar. Totally. And what I get to see and the kind of people that we've tried to bring into Bug Crowd to actually do these types of jobs, is this incredible commitment to balance and fairness. on both sides, and to support the community, to support the customer, to try to basically, walk that tightrope and get things right. When we screw it up, which does happen from time to time, we'll come in and correct it, as quickly as possible, and do that in a way that's as transparent as we can be. I think we've established a reputation for doing that at this point. Yeah. So, I feel comfortable saying that. Because
it's like I really think that maybe almost expectation setting needs to happen as well. From all sides, right? For the companies, the third party, and even the security researchers, I think, should have expectations set for them on how they treat triage people. Because I've seen some absolutely horrendous arguments to where it gets nasty, and so I can understand in that kind of case kicking them off a platform and stuff like that. And we, as the public, might never ever know what the real reason was. But I've seen some pretty nasty stuff. So it's almost like, all right, we need to establish better expectations, rules of engagement, and treat these triage people as humans, because they're treating you like a human too. So I kind of get all that. You know what I mean? I've pretty much seen a lot of just and not trying to give you like a how to suck eggs answer on this one. It's more for the benefit of the dialogue, because it is a hard role. It's one of those ones where I think there's been kind of going back to what you brought up at the front end of the call. There's a lot of noise happening at the moment, and that happens from time to time. There'll be a topic that people kind of orient around. The whole thing kind of catches on fire for a bit, and we do everything we can to listen to it, but then also respond to it in a way that's like mindful to the humans that are involved, and the emotions and the different things that are happening, but mostly focused up on the facts and what we can actually do to improve it going forward.
Yeah. Well, we've said it numerous times on this show in particular, and I can't talk about the other shows on Security Weekly, that technologists and business are so diametrically opposed when it comes to connecting. It's not even funny. And that's what a lot of the bug bounty programs are doing, is they're saying, okay, you guys work on the tech, we'll bring in the business and try and put the two of them together, and hopefully something beautiful comes out of that. So, kudos to you and BugCrowd, and kudos to the other platforms as well. But, is there a better way that the platforms can be more transparent as to what the client is looking for, rather than just sitting back saying, well, go over here and look for this stuff?
I think that's always something that can be like, as a computer scientist, right? I'm kind of a fan of Kirchhoff's principle applied to everything. Like, the enemy knows the system, right? So any kind of defense that relies on secrecy is ultimately gonna fail. And I think that's kind of the trend that we're seeing in terms of the breaches that have happened, and how people are thinking about security overall over the past 18 months. So there's that, but then there's the fact that no one's ready for that yet. Right. So it's this idea of like, how do we get from where we've been and push in that direction in a way that's mindful of the considerations that individual companies have, that's respectful to their audiences, to their markets, and so on. Bring transparency into it as much as possible, but obviously do that in a way that's serving the original purpose, which is to make sure that you can continue on as a business and do the things that you were setting out to do in the first place. So it's a really interesting balance. Like the work that we did in the US around, like, ahead of the elections last year with CISA and DHS, basically putting together policy for VDP on election systems in partnership with CISA, DHS, and others. Like, that was one of the reasons for doing that. This idea of like, we not only need to get more eyes on these systems to make sure that vulnerabilities get found and dealt with, but also there's this issue of like confidence and trust, which transparency will arguably help with. Like, that's an example of how I think this kind of thing can work. So the more of that, the better. But the reality is that that's a journey. Like, I don't think organizations are used to thinking like that for the better part, and it's really a matter of like guiding them in that process, I think.
So I want to dovetail on that real quick. Sorry, Scott. I need to sort of start wrapping up, but I wanted to touch on one topic that was one of the reasons why I asked you on the show, in our last couple minutes. It's sort of related, sort of shifting gears, but, what's your experience been in terms of, we've spent most of the time, I think, talking about how you sell the concept to your customer. What kind of experiences have you had, and anybody can pipe in, what are your recommendations on how you, again, in the context of PCI, you're not necessarily convincing your paying customer, conceptually that this is adequate to meet a requirement. You also have to convince an auditor or an assessor, or dare I say the QSA community within PCI. What are your experiences? What do you think works there? And anybody can pipe in on ideas of how to get the message across that this is an acceptable, however we define penetration testing, this is an acceptable way of doing it to satisfy compliance requirements.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll jump in. It was probably our fourth or fifth program that we ran back as a baby startup. Having come out of doing a lot of stuff in PCI and specifically pen testing, got a call at one point from someone that I used to work with saying, "Hey, we've got an audit next week. We need 40 or 50 hours of testing, over a 24-hour time frame." So like the proposition and kind of the value in their mind was more the fact that we could deploy multiple people at the same time to do assurance work that would satisfy the criteria of a pen test within a short, elapsed time window. And we did it, and it worked, and there was findings, and they fixed those things quickly, and they passed their audit. So that was, this is 2013. I think honestly, some of the noise and expectation around what a bug bounty is and isn't has actually gone and kind of added confusion to that. But at that point in time, it just kind of sailed through and everything was fine. So.
Wow. All right. Well, as I alluded to, we sort of need to wrap up here. It's been a great conversation, Casey. I appreciate it. You taking the time out of your busy late evening or morning, whatever it is. Any final thoughts? Any final words? I'll give you the last word here, Casey.
Yeah, for sure. Look, really appreciate y'all having me on. It's definitely morning or evening or some sort of time of the day
Afternoon.
Here at this point. It's actually 3:30 in the morning is the time here. So that's all good. But been a pleasure to chat. I think for listeners, honestly, second, if you got assumptions about the applicability of a model like BugCrowd's, I guess relevance to satisfying compliance within your organization, we've put a ton of work into making it happen and making it as frictionless for you all as possible. I think, Jeff, to your question just now, making sure that it's not just something that your auditor's going to be comfortable with, but something that you can get signed off on within the organization in terms of selling it internally. Reach out, Casey at bugcrowd.com. We're at bugcrowd.com. I'm on Twitter and all the other things. Happy to chat to anyone that wants to dig into that further. And frankly, looking forward to the opportunity to learn how to do this better and more from folk that are interested. That's something that we've always really valued. It takes a crowd is something that we always talk about, and that applies to building products and being more effective in the market as well.
So you're crowdsourcing, what do they call it? Product management, product marketing.
Dude, I tell you what, if you got a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So there is that.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Casey, again, thank you. It's going to wrap for us today. Be sure to tune in next week. We're going to keep with this theme of having international guests. And it's actually in response to a listener request who said, hey, could you cover ISO 27001 and 2 and so on and so forth? I'm certainly not an expert, but I reached out and was able to procure the time of Wim Reams. He is CEO, founder, principal consultant of Wire Security BVBA, which I think is probably the Belgian equivalent of LLC. I haven't Googled it yet. He's the past chairman of the board of ISC Squared, been around in the business a while, pretty active on Twitter. Hopefully he's getting better, because he's currently dealing with, I believe, a torn retina. Not to put his business out there, but make sure everybody's thinking of him so he's on the mend. But we are going to tackle ISO 27000 X, Y, and Z next week on Security and Compliance Weekly. Stay safe, stay secure, stay compliant, keep building those bridges and tearing down silos. We'll see you next week.